You can love someone and still have opinions. I was just being honest. It wasn't meant to hurt him. It was just a joke. Everyone says size doesn't matter, right? So why did one tiny comment destroy everything? The whole thing started so innocently. We'd been together for almost a year, living together for the last 4 months, and everything had been perfect. Matt was sweet, funny, successful, and completely devoted to making me happy. He cooked for me, planned romantic surprises, and never made me feel like anything less than the center of his universe. That Tuesday night had been like so many others we'd shared. We'd ordered pizza, watched a terrible reality show, and ended up in bed laughing about the ridiculous people we'd seen on TV. The conversation had naturally drifted to our past relationships and dating horror stories, something we'd done before without any drama. Matt was lying next to me, his head propped up on his elbow, looking at me with that satisfied smile he always wore after we'd been intimate. We'd been sharing embarrassing stories about our worst hookups and most awkward sexual encounters, the kind of conversation you can only have with someone you trust completely. That's when he asked the question that led to everything falling apart. He was grinning, clearly feeling confident and playful, when he asked if he was the best I'd ever had. It was the kind of fishing for compliments question that partners ask when they're feeling good about themselves and their relationship. I was feeling relaxed and comfortable, and the question seemed harmless enough. I wanted to be playful and honest, the way we always were with each other. So I told him he was perfect, absolutely perfect in every way except for size, but that everything else about him was chef's kiss worthy. The change in his expression was immediate and devastating. His smile didn't just fade, it completely collapsed, replaced by something I'd never seen from him before. He asked me to repeat what I'd said, like he couldn't believe he'd heard me correctly. I tried to laugh it off, saying it wasn't a big deal, literally, but that he was amazing in every other way that mattered. I was trying to minimize what I'd said, because I could see it had hit him harder than I'd intended, but everything I said seemed to make it worse rather than better. Matt rolled over and turned his back to me without saying another word. When I reached for him, trying to pull him back toward me so we could talk through whatever was happening, he pulled away from my touch. The rejection felt like a physical blow, especially since he'd never refused my affection before. I kept trying to explain that I hadn't meant anything cruel by my comment, that I was just being honest about one small thing in a relationship that was otherwise perfect. I said that physical attributes weren't important compared to emotional connection and compatibility, and that he satisfied me in ways that had nothing to do with anatomy. But Matt didn't respond to any of my explanations. He just lay there with his back to me, and I could feel the tension radiating from his body in waves. The easy intimacy we'd been sharing just minutes earlier had been completely destroyed by my thoughtless honesty. I finally gave up trying to get him to talk and fell asleep, hoping that morning would bring perspective and forgiveness. I figured he was just hurt and needed time to process what I'd said before we could discuss it rationally and move past the misunderstanding. I woke up the next morning to an empty bed and the sound of complete silence in our apartment. Matt was always up before me, usually making coffee and breakfast, so the absence of his normal morning routine was immediately unsettling. The quiet felt different, heavier, like the apartment itself was holding its breath. When I rolled over to his side of the bed, I found a folded piece of paper on his pillow where his head should have been. Next to it was a yellow measuring tape, the kind you'd use for home improvement projects, coiled neatly like a snake waiting to strike. My hands were shaking as I opened the note. His handwriting was calm and clear, which somehow made the message more devastating than if it had been angry or emotional. He'd written that he was leaving the measuring tape for the next guy I compared him to, and thanked me for my honesty. The casual cruelty of the note was stunning. This was the man who'd written me love letters for my birthday, who'd left sweet sticky notes on my coffee maker, who'd never said an unkind word to me in 11 months together. The coldness felt like it was coming from a stranger, rather than someone who'd told me he loved me just the day before. I called his phone immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried texting, but the messages weren't even being delivered, which meant he'd either turned his phone off or blocked my number entirely. The speed with which he'd cut off all communication was terrifying. I checked his location through the app we'd been sharing for months, but it showed that location sharing had been turned off. He'd systematically eliminated every way I had of reaching him or tracking him down, which suggested this hadn't been an impulsive decision made in hurt feelings. I ran to the closet to check his clothes and found that a significant portion of his wardrobe was missing. He'd packed a bag while I was sleeping, taking enough clothes for an extended stay somewhere else. The planning and premeditation behind his departure made it clear this wasn't just a cooling-off period. His toiletries were gone from the bathroom, his laptop was missing from the desk, and even his favorite coffee mug was nowhere to be found. He'd methodically removed himself from our shared space while being careful not to wake me, which felt like the ultimate rejection. I spent the morning calling his friends and family, trying to find out where he'd gone and whether anyone had heard from him. Most people seemed confused by my frantic calls, and those who had heard from Matt were polite but unhelpful, saying he needed space to think about things. The most devastating part was talking to his best friend Josh, who confirmed that Matt was staying with him, but wouldn't say for how long or whether Matt wanted to work things out. Josh's tone was sympathetic but distant, like he was talking to someone who'd hurt his friend beyond what was forgivable. I tried going to Josh's apartment building, but the doorman said I wasn't on the approved visitor list anymore, which meant Matt had specifically requested that I not be allowed up. The systematic way he was cutting me out of his life felt disproportionate to what I'd said. By evening, I was desperate enough to create fake social media accounts to try to see if Matt had posted anything about where he was or how he was feeling. But his accounts had been made private, and I was clearly blocked from accessing them under any name I might use. The next few days were a blur of increasingly desperate attempts to reach Matt and explain that my comment hadn't been meant the way he'd interpreted it. I sent emails to his work account, left voicemails with mutual friends, and even considered showing up at his office before realizing how crazy that would make me look. I crafted long text messages from different phone numbers, explaining the context of my comment and how it had been taken out of proportion. I wrote about how much I loved him and how one thoughtless joke shouldn't destroy almost a year of building something beautiful together. But every message went unanswered, and eventually, even the new phone numbers I was using started getting blocked. Matt was clearly committed to maintaining no contact, and my attempts to reach him were probably making the situation worse rather than better. I decided to try social media, posting a quote about how, if you can't laugh with the person you love, what's the point of being together? I was hoping Matt would see it and understand that my comment had been meant as playful teasing rather than serious criticism, but the responses I got were overwhelmingly critical rather than supportive. Even my closest female friends were asking why I would say something like that to someone I claimed to love. The comments section became a debate about what kinds of honesty were appropriate in relationships. One particularly harsh response said that some things don't need to be said, even if they're true. Another pointed out that I wouldn't have appreciated Matt making similar comments about my physical attributes. The criticism forced me to confront whether my honesty had really been as innocent as I'd convinced myself. I tried calling Matt's sister, hoping she might be more sympathetic to my side of the story, or willing to help mediate between us. But she was cold and protective of her brother, saying that he'd been hurt deeply and needed time to figure out what he wanted from his future. The conversation with his sister revealed that Matt had shared details about what I'd said with his family, which was humiliating, but also suggested that my comment had affected him more profoundly than I'd realized. I'd embarrassed him, not just privately, but within his support system. Work became torture as I struggled to concentrate on anything besides my relationship crisis. Colleagues noticed that I was distracted and emotional, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what had happened without making myself look terrible. My productivity plummeted as I spent most of my day checking my phone for messages that never came and refreshing social media to see if Matt had posted anything that might give me insight into his emotional state or future plans. The apartment felt haunted by his absence. Every corner reminded me of memories we'd made together, and I found myself talking to the empty rooms as if he might somehow hear me and understand how sorry I was for my thoughtless words. A week after Matt left, I discovered that our private crisis had become semi-public entertainment when mutual friends started sending me links to a TikTok video that was quickly going viral. Matt had posted a video of a measuring tape slowly unrolling on a table, with the caption, "Even the best need confidence to stay." The video was devastating in its simplicity and symbolism. He'd turned my cruel comment into content that thousands of people were viewing, commenting on, and sharing. The measuring tape had become a metaphor for inadequacy and rejection that resonated with viewers who didn't even know our story. The comments on his video were mostly supportive of him and critical of whoever had made him feel small. People were sharing their own stories about being hurt by insensitive partners, and Matt was being praised for his dignified response to what was clearly a painful situation. I felt sick watching strangers discuss our private relationship and validate Matt's decision to leave me. The video had turned me into the villain of a story that thousands of people now felt invested in, without them knowing any context about my intentions or our relationship history. Some of our mutual friends had clearly figured out that I was the unnamed girlfriend who'd caused Matt's pain, and they were reaching out with a mixture of concern and judgment. The messages ranged from gentle suggestions that I reach out to apologize, to harsh criticisms of my character and treatment of someone who'd loved me. The worst message came from Matt's co-worker, who said that Matt had been talking about proposing to me before this happened, and that he'd been devastated, not just by my comment, but by the realization that I saw him as fundamentally inadequate in such a basic way. Learning that Matt had been considering marriage made everything so much worse. I'd destroyed not just our current relationship, but also the future he'd been planning for us. All because I couldn't resist making a comment that served no purpose, except to demonstrate my own thoughtlessness. I tried to respond to some of the messages from friends, explaining that my comment had been taken out of context and that I'd never meant to hurt Matt. But my explanation sounded weak and defensive, even to me, and most people seemed to have already made up their minds about the situation. The social media attention was making it impossible for me to move on or forget what had happened. Every time I thought I might be able to start healing, someone would send me another screenshot or link related to Matt's viral video and the discussion it had generated. I considered making my own response video, explaining my side of the story and providing context for what had happened. But every draft I wrote made me sound petty and defensive, and I realized that publicly arguing with Matt would only make me look worse. The isolation was becoming overwhelming as friends and family started treating me like someone who'd committed an unforgivable social sin. Even people who'd known me for years were questioning my character and my capacity for empathy based on this one incident. 2 weeks into Matt's absence, I finally started to understand that this wasn't a temporary fight that would blow over with time and apologies. The measuring tape was still sitting on his nightstand like a monument to my cruelty, and I was beginning to accept that he might never come back to claim it or anything else he'd left behind. I'd been scrolling through our old text messages, looking for evidence that our relationship had been as perfect as I remembered, when I started noticing patterns in our communication that I'd never paid attention to before. Matt had often asked for reassurance about our relationship and his performance as a boyfriend. There were messages where he'd asked if I was satisfied with our physical relationship, if I found him attractive, if I thought we were compatible in important ways. I'd always given him positive responses, but now I could see that he'd been genuinely insecure about some aspects of our relationship. The realization that Matt had been struggling with confidence issues made my comment so much more devastating in retrospect. I'd unknowingly confirmed his worst fears about himself and our relationship, hitting him exactly where he was most vulnerable. I started going through our shared photo albums and videos, looking for signs of the insecurity I'd missed while we were together. In pictures where I'd thought he looked confident and happy, I could now see subtle signs of uncertainty in his expressions and body language. The therapy sessions I'd started attending helped me understand that my comment hadn't been as innocent as I'd convinced myself. The therapist pointed out that there had been no constructive purpose to what I'd said, and that my claim about just being honest was really about prioritizing my own comfort over Matt's feelings. We talked about the difference between honesty that serves the relationship and honesty that serves only the speaker's ego or need to express every thought that crosses their mind. My comment had clearly fallen into the latter category, providing no benefit to anyone involved. I began to see that my pattern of radical honesty in relationships had often been a way of maintaining power and control rather than building intimacy and trust. By positioning myself as the person brave enough to say difficult truths, I'd been protecting myself from vulnerability while making my partners feel criticized and inadequate. The measuring tape became a symbol not just of Matt's hurt feelings, but of my own capacity for casual cruelty disguised as authentic communication. I'd been so focused on my right to express my thoughts that I'd ignored my responsibility to consider their impact on someone I claimed to love. Looking back at our relationship, I could see other instances where I'd made unnecessarily critical comments under the guise of honesty or humor. I'd pointed out his receding hairline, joked about his cooking skills, and made comparisons between him and other men that probably chipped away at his confidence over time. The pattern I was discovering about myself was ugly but clarifying. I'd been using honesty as a weapon to keep Matt slightly off balance and insecure, ensuring that he'd continue working to prove himself worthy of my approval and affection. 3 weeks after Matt's departure, his TikTok video had been viewed over 1 million times and had spawned countless response videos from people sharing their own stories about being hurt by insensitive partners. I'd become an anonymous villain in a narrative about respect and dignity in relationships. The attention his video was getting meant that our private relationship crisis had become part of a larger cultural conversation about how people treat each other in intimate relationships. Matt was being held up as an example of someone who'd maintained his dignity while leaving a toxic situation. I'd started receiving direct messages from strangers who'd somehow figured out my identity through mutual connections. Most were critical, calling me shallow and cruel, but some were from women sharing their own stories about making similar mistakes in relationships. The messages from other women were somehow more devastating than the criticism because they showed me that my behavior wasn't unique or particularly shocking. There were apparently plenty of people who'd destroyed good relationships through thoughtless comments made in moments of comfort and intimacy. One message particularly stood out, from a woman who said she'd lost her husband of 5 years after making a similar comment about his appearance. She said she'd spent 3 years in therapy trying to understand why she'd felt the need to hurt someone she loved, and that she still regretted the impulse that had cost her the best relationship of her life. Reading about other people's similar experiences helped me understand that my comment hadn't been an isolated moment of poor judgment, but part of a pattern of behavior that I'd never examined or acknowledged. I'd been systematically undermining Matt's confidence while convincing myself I was just being authentic and honest. The viral nature of Matt's video also meant that potential future partners might recognize me and already know about my capacity for cruelty in relationships. The internet's long memory would make this mistake follow me indefinitely, affecting not just my relationship with Matt, but any future attempts at romantic connection. I'd tried to create new social media accounts to escape the association with Matt's story, but the story had spread enough that even using my real name was risky. I'd become infamous in certain corners of the internet as an example of how not to treat your partner. Work had become uncomfortable as colleagues discovered the connection between the viral video and my obvious emotional distress. Some were sympathetic, but others seemed to view me differently after learning what I'd done to someone who'd loved me. The professional consequences were adding to my stress as I struggled to maintain my reputation and relationships in an environment where my personal failures had become public knowledge. I was learning that private cruelty could have very public consequences in the age of social media. The apartment felt like a crime scene where I was the only witness to what had been destroyed. Matt's absence was a constant reminder of what I'd lost, but the measuring tape was an even more pointed reminder of what I'd done to cause that loss. A month after Matt left, I finally accepted that he wasn't coming back and that no amount of explanation or apology was going to repair the damage I'd caused. The measuring tape had become a permanent fixture on the nightstand, a daily reminder of the moment I'd destroyed the best relationship I'd ever had. I'd stopped trying to contact Matt through mutual friends and had deleted the social media accounts where I'd been trying to monitor his activity. The obsessive behavior was making my healing impossible, and probably making his recovery more difficult too. Matt had been planning to propose, according to mutual friends, and he'd been saving money for a ring while building a life that would accommodate both our dreams and goals. I'd destroyed not just our current happiness, but also the future he'd been working toward. The measuring tape served as a daily reminder that some words can't be taken back and some damage can't be repaired. No matter how sorry I was or how much I'd learned about myself, Matt would always remember that I'd chosen to hurt him in one of the most vulnerable moments two people can share. The loneliness was profound and persistent, especially during evenings and weekends when Matt and I would have been spending time together. I'd built a life that assumed his presence and participation, and learning to be alone again was more difficult than I'd anticipated. But I'd also learned to appreciate solitude in ways that had been impossible when I'd been constantly seeking validation through romantic relationships. The quiet evenings that had once felt lonely now felt peaceful, and I'd developed interests and routines that belonged entirely to me. The measuring tape remained on the nightstand as a reminder of what I'd lost and why I'd lost it. Some nights I would pick it up and think about throwing it away, but I always returned it to its place as a monument to the lesson I'd learned too late. I'd wanted to be the kind of person who could say anything to their partner without consequences, but I'd learned that love required restraint and consideration rather than unlimited honesty. Some thoughts were meant to stay thoughts, and some truths were too cruel to share. The woman who'd casually destroyed her boyfriend's confidence had been protecting herself from vulnerability by maintaining critical distance even in moments of intimacy. But that protection had cost her the chance to build something real with someone who genuinely loved her. Now I knew better, but Matt was building a life without me, and I was left to figure out how to become the kind of person who could love someone completely without needing to make them feel small. The measuring tape would always be there to remind me of what I'd learned and what it had cost me to learn it. You can love someone and still have opinions. But sometimes keeping those opinions to yourself is the more loving choice, and sometimes honesty isn't worth the price of speaking it.